Wow. Hi, good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all. Happy 2018, or 20 Chai, as my kid says. It's good to see you. These are really bright, aren't they? Am I crazy? Did they like put all these crazy lights in? Wow. You get a tan, I think, is what happens. Yeah. Well, it's good to see all of you, and welcome back. I hope everyone got through the rain and the mud and the stuff, and I think half of the congregation is still stuck somewhere on Ventura Boulevard. So it's good to see everybody, and welcome back. A couple of announcements of things going on in the community in the coming weeks. This Friday night is the Rimonim service, beautiful musical Shabbat service. We have snacks and nosh at 6 o'clock. The service begins at 6:30. Everyone is invited. It's a great service to enjoy beautiful Jewish music. Of course, every Shabbos morning, 9 o'clock, we have Torah study, and you're all certainly invited to join us for that. On Friday the 19th, which is next Friday night, right? On Friday the 19th, we're going to celebrate the Martin Luther King holiday weekend by welcoming the wonderful choir from Faith Central Bible Church. This is the best choir you ever heard in your life. These people will make you want to jump out of your seat and sing hallelujah. It is fabulous. We're also going to be welcoming the choir and the rabbis from Beit Tshuva. Rabbi Mark will be here, and some of the members of the Beit Tshuva community, and we're going to talk about Martin Luther King, Abraham Heschel, and the Jewish community's response to civil rights. So please join us. It's next Friday night. It's going to be at 7:30. It's a gospel night of Jewish gospel. How's that? Does that work? Now, if you're going to do Jewish gospel, you got to put your hands in the air and go hallelujah. You can't sit there quietly like most of you are used to doing. They won't let you do that, okay? This coming Sunday is the Chavurah Fair. Those who'd like to be attached to a Chavurah, please show up. Those who have Chavurot looking for new members, please show up. It's a wonderful gathering of members of the community who are looking for community, looking for connection. And one more announcement. There's lots of other things going on, so pick up some flyers on your way out. We're going to go to Israel in March. The congregation is sponsoring a trip. This is a trip. It's March 7th through 14th, the second week in March. And it's a trip. It's not a trip for first-timers. If you've never been to Israel, we'll take you on that trip, but that's a different trip. This is a trip for people who've been to Israel before and have seen most of the principal tourist sites and are interested instead in really coming to understand the inner life of the state of Israel. The issues and the problems, the dilemmas, and the possibilities that really drive the culture of Israel. And the way we do the trip is we gather, it's just for adults, and we spend each day on a topic. So the first day's topic, for example, is going to be Israel and international security. We're going to talk about Israel and the region with the northern commander of the Israeli Defense Forces. He's going to be our tour guide for the day, the guy that protects the Golan and the Lebanese border. And then the next day, we're going to talk about Israel and its identity. What does it mean to be an Israeli? What does it mean to be an Israeli Jew? How is that changing? We're going to go to Jerusalem. We're going to talk about Israel and the ultra-Orthodox. Who are the ultra-Orthodox? And something amazing is happening among the younger generation of the ultra-Orthodox. We'll talk about Israel and the Palestinians. We're going to go up to Ramallah and visit with the government of the Palestinians and get to know their narrative and what their vision of the future is. Each day has a topic like this. We stay in lovely hotels, and we finish each evening in a wonderful restaurant with a beautiful meal and copious amounts of wine. So please come and join us. Here's the flyer. There's a flyer to pick up. Alana is right back. She just came back from Israel herself, and she's here, and if you want more information, she'll give you all the background information. We'd love to have each and every one of you join us for the trip. It's actually a lot of fun. It's also a wonderful way to meet people, and it's a wonderful opportunity to learn together and to grow together. Okay? Those are the announcements. Did I leave anything out? Probably. So please rise from your seats. It's been a year since we've seen each other. Turn to one another and say good evening and welcome. And now don't sit down. As is our custom, put your arms about the people next to you and draw them close. Draw them close. Stand next to a really good-smelling Jew from Tarzana. And share with us a blessing for the opportunities to learn together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Ya'aseh shalom, Ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, Ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, Ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, Ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, Ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. This year we have taken on the task of doing a very quick summary, a survey of the history of the Jewish people, which is a chutzpahdik thing to do because the history of the Jewish people is some 3,500 years long, and to do that in only the course of 12 or 15 sessions is not an easy thing to do. So we began by looking at the Bible, at the biblical civilization. And I pointed out to you my conviction that geography is destiny, that the two great ancient civilizations, Egypt and Mesopotamia, are connected by a highway, and that's exactly where God put us, on that highway. I told you that you should never go to Hawaii because you'll do what I did. You'll go to Maui. My wife schlepped me to Maui Mountain. I stood on top of that mountain. I looked at the clear blue sea, at the crystal sand beach, at the peaceful, sweet people, and I turned my eyes toward heaven, and I said, Rabbeinu Shalom, Master of the world, you knew about this place? And you put us where? In the middle of everything? Are you crazy? Could you imagine, had we been on an island, Jewish history would be very boring. It'd be very simple, right? We left Egypt, we crossed the sea, we arrived. I would call the island, there's Kauai, there's Lanai, there's Maui. I would call the island Alavai, a Jewish island, right? We'd wear grass skirts, we'd have luau's. That'd be the end of Jewish history. That's all it is. Unfortunately, God had other plans. And we sat right in the middle of the two great ancient civilizations. And that is the story of biblical Judaism. Abraham came from Mesopotamia. Moses came from Egypt. We lived in Canaan. How you combine those three civilizations and arrive at an original interpretation of the human condition is really what Judaism is all about. Then we went from the biblical civilization to rabbinic civilization. Rabbinic civilization begins when we arrive back from Mesopotamia, back from Babylon after the destruction of the temple, after the exile. And now Judaism is focused on Torah. There is a temple in Jerusalem, but Torah becomes the focus of Judaism. The temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. And then without a temple and without a place in the world, Torah becomes the territory of the Jewish people. Most of the population begins to leave Eretz Yisrael. It leaves Israel, most. There was always a Jewish population in places like Hebron and Tiberia and Yerushalayim. But the biggest bulk of the population moves eastward to Mesopotamia and goes either in Mesopotamia or farther east into Iraq, into Persia. And under the government of the Persian government, we flourish in Mesopotamia. And there we develop the great interpretations of the Bible, which we call Talmud. And that's the rabbinic civilization that we looked at together. Now, beginning and the professor will tell us exactly what date, but I'll guess around the 6th century, about 500, with the completion of the Babylonian Talmud, something else happens. The Persian government becomes unstable, and the Jewish community realizes that its future is not going to be there, and we disperse. Jewish communities all over the Mediterranean, from as far west as Spain and Gaul, and as far east as Afghanistan and India. And we are a dispersed people. Pockets of Jewish communities, pockets of Jewish life, living in every land, speaking every language, absorbing every culture, dealing with Islam in the south, Christianity in the north, Zoroastrianism in the east, all of these different cultures impacting on Judaism. This is the story of what we call the Jewish Middle Ages. Pockets of Jewish life under all of these different circumstances. Sometimes there was peace, sometimes there was strife. But how the Jewish people lived under all these circumstances, that's going to be the question that we're going to look at for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So tonight, we're going to talk about the whole picture, and you have a map in front of you and a professor who's going to be your tour guide. Next week, when we return next week, same place, same time, we're going to look at one character, the most outstanding intellectual of the Jewish Middle Ages, a man named Moses, the son of Maimon, who's often known as the Rambam or Maimonides. And our teacher will be Professor Dina Aronoff of GTU of Berkeley. And then the following week, we're going to look at Sephardic culture in its development, and we've invited Professor Sarah Stein from UCLA to talk about Sephardic culture for the simple reason that most of us are gringos. Gringos mean you came from Eastern Europe and you eat gefilte fish. And if all you know is gefilte fish and you think that's Jewish cooking, there's a whole other world you don't know. Tonight, we're going to begin this investigation of the Jews of the Middle Ages, and our guest is Professor Joshua Hollow, who is Professor of Jewish History at Hebrew Union College and the academic head of Hebrew Union College. He's the principal of the school. He's the Dean of Academics for Hebrew Union College. And I just found this out because I had this idea that you lived far away in some ethereal land of intellectual. He grew up around the corner. He grew up 4 blocks from here, and he had his bar mitzvah right here. Right? And guess what? The room that he remembers most dearly is Weiner Chapel, because that's where Yossi Dresner yelled at him. In other words, we want to welcome Professor Hollow back to teach us tonight. Professor teaches the history of the Jews of the Middle Ages, the Jews of Byzantium at Hebrew Union College, and guides rabbinical students and graduate students through their work. Please welcome Professor Hollow. You've got to speak right into this mic or they'll yell at you. Okay?
I know that you will yell at me if I need to get yelled at. I trust that. It's not just that I celebrated my brothers and my bar mitzvah here, nor that I was raised literally at Encino Little League, but it's really more than an honor, a pleasure to be back home where I grew up and where this community planted one of the seeds in my Jewish soul. And I am so, so thankful to you that you invited me, Rabbi Feinstein. It was an easy thing for me to say yes to and come and speak to you. So I hope you have your rotten tomatoes ready to throw, and we can get into this for real, because we're going to talk about the Jewish Middle Ages, and it gets pretty hairy pretty fast, because most of us actually know the Jewish Middle Ages as a period of what? What's one of the major themes of the Jewish Middle Ages? Sorry? Dark Ages, yeah, they're called the Dark Ages, not promising already. What else? Crusades, very bad for the Jews. Anything else? Inquisition, if you're not a very funny Englishman who can make great movies about it, it's not very funny. What else? Blood libels, expulsions, mass murders, pogroms, all of which is true. But there's also the Golden Age of Spain. You will hear about, forgive me as I figure this out, you'll hear about Maimonides in a few short weeks. And we are going to begin to bring some color to this experience in ways that I hope you find very rich. So I'm going to pick up where Rabbi Feinstein left off by talking about geography as a way to frame our conversation, because I want to claim something to you tonight. I want to argue, we didn't plan this, that this notion that you're a product of your geography applies indeed to the Middle Ages, and I'm gonna paint that picture for you before we really get into it. So, I want to show you the first map. Look at this first map on your and you can see that it's the Mediterranean. And this is a map of what we call late antiquity, which is roughly the rabbis. And there were indeed Jews already dispersed in the rabbinic period. But if you look, the dots are intended to be proportional to the size of the communities. And if you look at the biggest dots, you're looking at Babylon, which is roughly Ctesiphon in Persian, or Baghdad today, Alexandria in Egypt on the delta, Yavne in northern Israel, where the rabbis moved their center of learning after the temple was destroyed, and Rome off to the west. But that's about it. The other dots are smaller because they're intended to represent smaller Jewish communities. So it's not that there isn't a dispersion, it's that the dispersion is more limited, and it's more focused on very, very specific places. But that's actually not the point that I want to make. I want you to flip over this piece of paper and look at the world of the rabbis, late antiquity as we historians call it. And what do you notice about this map, the colored parts? What do you notice about it? How would you describe this map in terms of the colors? How many colors are there? Yeah, there's the gray, which is sort of places where, as you saw on the previous map, there really aren't many Jewish communities at all. And then the two remaining colors are orangish yellow and greenish whatever. And the orangish yellow corresponds to what? The Roman Empire. And the greenish kind of unsavory color corresponds to what? The Persian Empire. This was a polar world of two great superpowers. And all of the Jewish communities, even if we acknowledge that there was a little bit more dispersion than sometimes we think, we look at all of these cities and they all fall into one of these two empires. And so with respect to Rabbi Feinstein's argument that we're the product of this geographical situation in which we find ourselves, in the Bible, it was the crossroads of the great empires. Well, in late antiquity, the period prior to the Middle Ages, where we're going to start, there were also two great empires, the Romans and the Persians. And the Jewish, yes. Usually we talk about the 2nd to 5th centuries or so, 1st to 5th centuries. The Babylonian Talmud is traditionally claimed to have been completed around 425 CE. The Jerusalem Talmud is claimed to have been completed around 500, as Rabbi Feinstein mentioned. And that usually ends roughly the rabbinic period, but it goes on a little bit more because we have the people who edited the Talmudim called the Amoraim wrote it, and then the Savoraim edited it, and it's kind of a tail end before we get to the really full-blown Middle Ages. We're going to really pick up our story with the rise of Islam, which is in 622, when Muhammad escapes Mecca and goes to Medina and has his revelations and builds his community, really. But right now, this is the world we inherited, this polar world. So when we speak of Jewish cultures and the Jewish experience, we really speak of a Roman Jewish experience, which includes the land of Israel, and a Persian Jewish experience, which includes the world of the Babylonian Talmud, which Rabbi Feinstein pointed out was dominant in many ways, for lots of reasons we won't go into. But with the end of the Savoraim, the editors of the Talmudim, and within 150 years, the rise of Islam, this meteoric splash of a brand new civilization thrown across the map, including the Jews swept up in it, the world changed irrevocably. Never again would the map, literal or conceptual, ever look the same again. And so you look at the next map, the black and white map, which is really just a little taste of the diversity of the Jewish population in the Middle Ages. It covers a long period, so I'm not so worried about the time period. Roughly, we usually mean the Jewish Middle Ages from the 7th century, that's Muhammad, up until usually 1492, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. That's the traditional era of the Middle Ages. But if you look at the key on the bottom left, you see Ashkenazi culture, the French subculture, the Polish-Lithuanian subculture, the Southern Italian culture. We tend to think of Ashkenazim and Sephardim. But if you include the Yemenites, the Persians, the North Africans, and all these guys, the subcultures of the Italians and the Ashkenazim, you realize that Judaism at this point is not Ashkenazi Sephardi, even though we tend to rely on those two categories or super categories. It's already a patchwork, a quilt of languages and cultures and food and rabbinic traditions and yeshivot and economics that looks something much more vibrant and much messier of a map. And why? Well, flip the page yet again. And if we are going to argue that the Jewish story is at least largely a product of the story of geography, well, look at the way the same world looked in the Middle Ages. All of a sudden, it's not two superpowers anymore. Just look at the color scheme of this crazy world in which the Jews lived. Both Muslim, which was fractured already, the Muslim world fractured within a couple hundred years of the rise of Islam, and then the Christian world, look at that, the northern half of the Mediterranean. It's a complete mess. And the Jewish world was in that world, and so our black and white map reflects our color map for this multifaceted Jewish community, which is no longer just Roman and Persian. That is the world that we're going to talk about today. And because it is so complicated and varied, and it lasts so long, it's from the 7th century all the way to the 15th, it's extremely difficult to make a timeline because you have about 6 or 8 or 10 timelines. The Moroccans going to the Tunisian with the Karaites, running into the Alexandrian philosophers, while the Christian Jews, the Jews in Christendom, are navigating the Jerusalem Talmud as opposed to the Yerushalmi Talmud. All this happening over centuries and in different places with migrations. It's a mess. Another mess. And so we're not going to do that. I'm not going to give you dates. I'm not going to tell you about kings and queens and pogroms and blood libels and expulsions. You can look at a map for that. It's online, and there are many great stories to be told, and that's one way to do it. But if we're going to hang out together for an hour, I want to talk about something you can walk away with. And the story tonight is about a period of 15 years. 15 telling and terribly destructive years in France. And in the years between 1232 and 1244, two remarkable events happened. Within those 12 years, there were two vicious, devastating book burnings. Now, no one in this room is immune to the chill that creeps up our spine when we talk about book burnings. Am I right? For lots of reasons. Because we're liberal Democrats and we live in an enlightened society, and because we're Jews and we know what it means. For many, many reasons. None of us is immune to the destructive echoes of book burnings. But pause for one moment to imagine something with me. Pause to imagine a world in which a book burning does not merely offend your sensibilities as an enlightened thinker and an open-minded person to the critical universe of ideas that live in books, nor merely as a Jew who knows the power of flames. Pause to think with me about what it means to have mass book burnings in a pre-printing press world, where a book is a precious thing, not because you are enlightened and you value knowledge so much so that it's precious, although that too, but because the production of a book or a scroll is years of work. It starts with the lamb that is slaughtered for its skin, and the tanning of the hides and the mixing of the inks and the rare scholarship that can dedicate years to punctilious copying or composition, and then the very, very expensive sale of a book. This is not just a different world of culture and language. This is a different economy. You wake up to a different world. And so, when we talk about 2 book burnings of sacred Jewish texts in France within 12 years, any self-respecting historian pauses and says, what was happening between 1232 and 1244 that such a conflagration should have taken place? Well, what those things teach us will give you a glimpse, a small taste of this patchwork of complexity that I can't teach you with lists of kings and chronological tables. And I'm going to tell you the story tonight of 2 sets of ideas that happened to meet in France in the first half of the 13th century. The first story is the story of science versus religion. But they didn't call it that back then. Today, we talk about creationism versus evolution, or we talk about global warming, or we talk about abortion. There are a million things that are inflected with the scientific discourse in this country. A million ways, and there are very, very powerful disagreements about the role of the scientific consciousness versus the role of the theist, religious consciousness. We all know this, right? I'm not saying anything factually inaccurate. This is alive. We care about this. Well, in the Middle Ages, they didn't call it science versus religion. They called it revelation versus philosophy. And the reason I want to point out that this isn't about philosophy is because philosophy for them was really science. Just the same way science is for us. When we think about how the polio vaccine was discovered, it was a scientific process. That's what they meant when they said philosophy. The capacity to look at the world and to say that you can understand truth because you can study it, observe it, ask questions about it, and come up with answers. That's philosophy for the Middle Ages. So we're going to call it philosophy versus revelation, but it means the same thing today as science versus religion, and it held the same stakes, if not higher. And so I want you to have a taste of science versus religion, something that I think we can relate to in the Middle Ages. And so I point you to Roman numeral, is it Roman numeral 2? Saadia Gaon, is that the first text you have? Roman numeral 3? Blame auto-filling text there, yeah. Thank you. So do you have the custom of reading out loud, or do you read quietly here? Shall I read out loud? Yeah? Okay. Saadia Gaon was a 10th century leader of the Jewish people and scholar, one of the most dominant personalities in all of Jewish history. Famous for many things, which I will not go into, but one of the things he was famous for was bringing Muslim philosophical ideas into Islam. Specifically, you didn't know he was a Muslim, but Aristotle. Aristotle, of course, was not a Muslim. He was a pagan Greek, but it was the Muslims who preserved Aristotelian rational philosophy. And it was very attractive to the early Muslims, and the Muslims had trouble with it too, because it threatened their religious sensibilities, and it also became a question in the Jewish world, in the Muslim world. We call them Islamicate Jews. We're not Muslim Jews because we're not Muslims, but we live in the Islamic world, so we're called Islamicate Jews. And let's look at the question. This is Saadia Gaon. The Lord, be he exalted and glorified, has informed us through the words of his prophets, that's Torah and Tanakh, that he wishes us to lead a religious life by following the religion which he instituted for us. That's our religion, Judaism. This religion contains laws, Sharia. If you're wondering what Sharia is halakha. It's law, religious law. which he, that's God, has prescribed for us, and which it is our duty to keep and full in its sincerity. Thus far, without reading ahead, what is the fundamental value that Saadia is articulating? What's he saying is important in these words that I've just read? Sorry, can you repeat that? We've got the laws, and they come from God. And when a leading Jew says that they come from God, what's he referring to exactly? Torah, and where was Torah given to us? Torah from Sinai. So in Jewish parlance, we say Torah mi Sinai, Torah from Sinai, to mean revelation, because that's how we understand revelation. Okay. His messengers, those are the prophets, established these laws for us by wondrous signs and miracles, and we commenced to keep and fulfill them forthwith. We were all good Jews back then. And as soon as God gave us Torah, we were quick to take it up. Later, we found that speculation, that is, scientific or philosophical thinking, ideas that you derive from observation, that speculation confirms the necessity of the law for us. It would, however, not have been appropriate for us to leave us to our own devices. These last two sentences, later we found that speculation confirms the necessity of the law for us. What does that mean? Someone raise your hand. Help me out. Dad, what does that mean? Science confirmed the laws of Torah. In that formulation, yes, thank you. In that formulation, which has priority? Law. Torah has priority, and science is the proof, after the fact, later. So we have a hierarchy, Torah and science. Speculation, which he means philosophical speculation. It would not, however, have been appropriate to leave us to our own devices. So once you learn the truth through science, you could say, okay, that's great, now I know it by scientific reason, so I'm done. But he's saying, no. We still need Torah. We don't want to be little kids in the sandbox here. We need our Torah. All right. So what I want the takeaway to be from Saadia's, this is some of the most compelling philosophy in all of Jewish history. So hang in there. It doesn't always feel compelling. But there's a message here. And the message from Saadia Gaon is Torah first, and science is great to help out Torah, to make it clear, to give us more proof for Torah. But now you're going to get a little sneak preview to Maimonides, who later would eclipse Saadia as the greatest intellect of the Middle Ages, but he was a follower of Saadia. And a critic of Saadia. And here is what he says on the same issue. This is also the reason why Torah speaks the language of humankind. This is a phrase that we use. It means Torah dibra bilshon bnei adam. It's Torah speaks in human language. In other words, God could speak to us through ESP if God wanted to, right? There's nothing, God can do what God wants to do. God could just transmit via radio Torah into our brain if God wanted to. But God chose to convey meaning in the language that is native to the human condition. Language. Verbal language. And verbal language is imprecise. It's subject to the vagaries and the craziness of humans. If I say glasses, I don't necessarily mean the same pair of glasses you mean. If I say happy, I may not be deriving the same source of joy, but we still have these words and we try to locate them as best we can in our impoverished human way. For it is the goal of Torah to serve as a guide for the instruction of the young, of women, of the common people. I cut out the part where he says people who can't think straight. But I'm telling you, I cut it out, so I'm undermining myself a little bit. But this is classic sexist, medieval thinking that children and women aren't really up to the task. I only left it to point out that he's going to establish a distinction. We need to appreciate the distinction, as fallacious as it may be. Tradition was considered sufficient to convey all truths which were established for these people who needed it. But, when a man attains to perfection and arrives at a knowledge of the secrets of the law, he will belong to those who faithfully believe in the true prophets, principles, either because of conclusive proof, scientific deduction, or forcible, probably the better translation here would be forceful, compelling, convincing argumentation. He will have a true notion of those things which he previously received in similes and metaphors. So the similes and metaphors is the bookend to this paragraph. The paragraph started saying Torah was conveyed to us in the limited language of the human experience, words. And words have to be metaphorical because they're imperfect. They're never exactly what they mean. We have to work through it. So Torah is imperfect. What is the real key to truth? Capital T, truth, according to Maimonides? Sorry? Science, rationality, reason, deduced observation and inference and all of those things that make up the scientific method. We have here, if you were to read these two paragraphs side by side quickly, you might think you have two really intellectualized rabbis hanging out in the Middle Ages, but in fact you have a total inversion. Saadia Gaon is saying Torah first and science is great as a confirmation of Torah. It's a footnote. Maimonides says Torah is in fact almost a hindered attempt to reach people who need color, who need a story. But if you really want to get down into it, it's got to be science. You have to have a hypothesis and a test and the whole thing, just like we learned in 10th grade. Well, that's pretty radical. This is a leading rabbi. You've heard of Maimonides. He was a communal leader. This is huge. Friends, this is heresy. This is punishable. Maimonides, the one philosopher any one of you in this room would know from the Middle Ages, is a raging heretic. And believe me, that mattered. Let's look at someone from a subsequent generation who makes what appears to be a slightly hyperbolic statement about Maimonides and his inversion of core Jewish values. Solomon ibn Adret from Spain, in a compilation of the arguments that surrounded Maimonides, says, go into the faraway lands inhabited by the Canaanites. That's a code term for the Christians. Christians were not considered monotheists by the Jews of the Muslim world. And indeed today, there's a Jewish debate insofar as Jews are comfortable talking about this. Many of us are not comfortable talking about it because we don't want to offend our Christian neighbors. Rightly so. But there is a Jewish position whereby Christianity is not deemed to be monotheistic. And there are slightly more lenient Jewish positions about Christianity as well. But this is coming from a position, calling them the Canaanites is a way of saying that they are polytheists. And all Gentiles. Gentiles usually means Muslims, although not necessarily. Sometimes these words are imprecise. These Jews who live amongst the Christians would condemn the Maimonideans as heretics, even for a single heresy and abomination that they had written in their books. And they would tie them up in vine branches and incinerate them till they burnt into ashes. And I'm here to tell you that in 1232, that is exactly what happened. The first of these book burnings by the Dominican friars in Montpellier, France, were not acting in a pogrom fashion to keep the Jews down. They were acting on the orders or request, really, the political lobby of Jews who wanted to quash Maimonides' thoughts, because Maimonides was a raging heretic. He inverted Torah and subjected it to science, the Word of God compared to a beaker in a laboratory. That's what Maimonides did. And they burned his books in Montpellier, France. In this, we find major themes of Muslim influence, philosophical exchange, and a terrible clash amongst Jewish philosophies, which took the ugliest of forms. And that's only one of our book burnings. If we go to the next one, I realize now that I had it in inverted order, but we're moving forward in time to 1240. In 1240 in Paris, under King Louis IX, who would later become a saint, the Jews, there's a completely different world now. We're moving from Cairo of Maimonides all the way across the Mediterranean into the north, from the Muslim world to the Christian world, where a man named Nicolas Donin, a Jew who converted not by force but by choice to Christianity, and became a friar. And in his zeal, you have to understand, a Jew who converted, a learned Jew who converted to Christianity in the Middle Ages was a bit of a rock star with the Pope and the powers that be because they were a tool. And depending on their zeal, they may have welcomed the attention. And this man, Nicolas Donin, had the ear of the monarchy. And he said in his zeal and I think we would all agree his bile, his rage at the Jews, his former people, he proposed a trial. I get to do this. Some of you have, I know some of you have teenaged kids. Can you all do this with me? A trial. I get to do the, I've always wanted to do that. And soon I'll be rolling my eyes. So, of course, it's a sham trial. No crime is even purported. Well, we'll talk about the crime in a minute. But it is the most powerful Christian institutions, the church and the monarchy, joining forces in a room and forcibly bringing in a panel of rabbis to sit and answer charges, religious charges, against, in this case, Jesus. And so there's a lot more to this, as you can imagine. The rabbi says, I deny the legitimacy of this kangaroo court. You can't bring, and they fight it out, but the rabbi has no choice. This is a forced disputation, as we call it. In Hebrew, it's called a vikuach, a dispute, and we call them forced disputations, usually. I don't know if they're called other things as well, but and we're going to read a little bit of it. It's a fascinating read about this confrontation. So there's two versions of the same confrontation, one in Latin, one in Hebrew, and you'll be shocked to hear that, they each have a side. The Hebrew one is written by the rabbis for the Hebrew readership, and the Latin, the opposite. In this part that I want to read to you, I'm starting with Donin, who is the friar, the former Jew. And he makes his first attack, or this is maybe his second attack. He says, the Talmud contains blasphemies against Jesus. For example, the Talmud says that Jesus is in hell. Now, are you, have many, raise your hand if you've encountered the notion that there's no hell in Judaism. Have you encountered that people say that, like, we don't have heaven and hell, or we don't have hell? Have some of you heard that? It's sort of, you hear it around. It's not true. Watch out. It's not that we don't have hell. It's that it's not a very well-developed idea. In any stage of our religious philosophy or religious literature, we have no Dante to imagine a literal inferno. But we do have the notion of punishment and reward, which is really actually an important part of the worldview of the rabbis. But it's not it's not something that we've developed in a narrative way, the way Catholicism has, and not something that we've defined. I think the tradition has chosen not to define it. But it does exist. And so the Donin is not making this up. In fact, in the Talmud, it says that Jesus is in hell, and his punishment is to be immersed in a boiling excrement. And he turns to Queen Blanche. This is the mother of Louis IX, who would later become St. Louis. He says, this is in order to make us Christians stink. That's a Hebrew idiom. Lehavish et rechenu, to make us stink, which means to make us look bad. And it's a pun because it's excrement, so it does stink. And the idea here is what? What's Donin saying about the Jews, or the Talmud in this case? What's he saying? Sorry? It's not a trick question. He's saying that you, Jews, really do hate us, revile us, and you did kill Jesus all the way. So this is a big deal, right? We all know about the baggage surrounding killing Jesus. To which our hero, Yechiel, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, responds, for the last 15 years since you, Donin, you apostate, you who left the people, you separated from us, you have sought to ensnare us, but you will not succeed. This Jesus mentioned here in the Talmud is another Jesus. Exactly. They didn't buy it either. It's just another Jesus. Not the one whom the Christians worship. This was a certain Jesus who mocked the words of the sages and believed only in the written scripture like you. Now, Donin may have been a Karaite, which means he may not have believed in the rabbinic revelation of Talmud. We're not going to go there for now. We can take questions. Maybe Rabbi Feinstein would like to talk about that. But the point here is the rabbi looks at it and says, oh, we're not talking about Jesus, your Jesus. We're talking about Jesus Jones, not Jesus Smith. It's fine, man. No worries. This is just, you would have burned this Jesus too. And he says, you can tell this because he's not actually called Jesus of Nazareth, but simply Jesus. After all, not every Louis born in France is King Louis of France. Now, I grew up in this shul, and I can attest to this. My name is Joshua, which is a version of Jesus, the same Hebrew etymology. And when teacher said Josh, there were 6 heads that turned at any given moment. And there was no way that you could walk around in this town being named Josh without being known as a Jew, even if your name was Holo and people couldn't quite place your last name. This is a common name. It happens. Now, I don't actually want to get into the merits or lack thereof of this particular argumentation. It does lend itself to a little bit. Even the Christians, later on in the same text that I didn't include, the queen goes, seriously? It actually happens. But that's not what I want to point out. What I want to point out is, how is it possible, just like the story I told you about myself, in these very halls, with a common name, how is it possible that this argument should even be conceivable? What do you need in this story? If you're going to say it's not that Jesus, it's another Jesus, what do you need in ancient Roman Palestine? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Yes, it is true. It is true. There's other places where it's just as bad, about Mary being a prostitute, and there's all kinds of stuff. Not all kinds of stuff, meaning that there's volumes and volumes of it, but there are a good half dozen or so places where the Talmud is very directly disparaging of Jesus. And no one today doubts that they're talking about Jesus. This only makes sense if Jesus is a common name, just like Joshua was a common name in the 70s. Now, if Jesus is a common name, what are we pointing about? What does that mean about the Jesus? Like their Jesus, the real one. What does it mean about his ethnicity? It definitely means he was a common man, but he was a common what? What ethnicity was he? He's a common Jew. So this is huge. We really have to appreciate this. This is what this is about. As distinct from the world of the Muslims, it matters that Jesus was Jewish. And it matters because it means something about the Christian experience. It means the following. It means that there is no way to understand the Christian story without it understanding itself as a continuation of our story. And not only a continuation of our story, but the culmination of our story. Which means we lose the ending to our own story. They get to hijack it. Now, that's fine and good for us because we don't care. But it's not so fine and good when you're hauled into court by a political, coercive power that can impose this story on you. So while it is kind of silly that a rabbi would say, no, that's Jesus, the other Jesus, it's reflective of the heart of the problem that the Jews in Christian Europe faced. And one more very, very important thing, which is our last paragraph from the Latin version. And the Latin version says, this is the Latin version accusing, this is the accusation. It says, the rabbi said further that in the schools they study the Talmud more earnestly than the Bible, and that no one can be called master, which means rabbi, unless he knows the whole Talmud, even if he knows the whole Bible by heart. Now, what I'm telling you is that Christianity is in its DNA is connected to us, even though we don't see ourselves as connected to Christianity, and that asymmetry causes all these problems. Well, the notion that we have a living tradition which is independent of the Bible, namely the Talmud, that means that we have a living Jewish tradition which has nothing to do with the Christian story so much that you don't even have to know the Bible to become a rabbi according to this. Even if you do know the Bible, that's great, but what you really got to know is Talmud, because we have a living legal tradition, a civilization. And all of a sudden, the Christians in this thing are waking up and saying, whoa, the Jews are not the biblical people we thought they were. They're not the people of Jesus, which means that they will not conform to our story. Is everyone with me? You need Jesus to be Jesus the Jew in order for Jesus the Christian God to be the Christian God. And you need the Jews to be the example of the first stage so that you can move into the second stage. But then you find out, whoa, the Jews have been developing all along in their own way. That's a shock to the system. It's a shock to their own ideology. And the result, as I began this talk, is the Talmud burning of 1244. Because the notion that there's a living Jewish tradition that is not the Jesus Jews that they can identify with is catastrophic. And it's embodied in the Talmud. And so they burn the Talmud. And the irreconcilable difference between Judaism and Christianity happens relatively close in time and space to the irreconcilable or apparently irreconcilable difference between Jewish philosophy and anti-Jewish philosophy, as it were. In other words, such radically unrelated dynamics, Jewish-Christian relations versus science and religion, I mean, all of these things going on in this crazy patchwork of a world, as Rabbi Feinstein said, from Afghanistan all the way to the British Isles, happened to meet in this crazy way in France in 12 short years. It happened to be conflict. There are many wonderful, beautiful stories that are less conflicted. But we have to understand what it means for Muslim philosophy, which was the vehicle for pagan Greek philosophy, shaped our Judaism with terrible birth pangs. At the same time, as Jewish-Christian relations took shape with terrible birth pangs on the same continent. And just as a brief example of this, let us pause to ask, before my comments, how many of you would have said that Christianity is a monotheistic religion? Monotheistic religion, yeah. Most American Jews living in a predominantly Christian country would probably say that Christianity is one of the three great monotheistic traditions. And that's part of this story of figuring out how to live in Christianity, which has many, many more stories I could tell. But you can see how it worked itself out in very complicated ways. And then another question I would ask you is, how many of you believe that God is a man with a white beard up in the clouds and looks like Eddie Feinstein? How many of you believe? Yeah, Eddie's raising his hand. How many of you actually believe that in your Jewish religious souls? Do you really believe that there's a dude up in the clouds with a really long beard? No, right? Well, that's because of Maimonides. Maimonides was the one who articulated an absolutely disembodied God that is that represents a kind of totality that is ultimately philosophical because you can't really visualize it. But we have many stories that do visualize. Not least of all is the Garden of Eden, when God walks in the garden to look for Adam. There are all these tensions going on, all these facets to our Jewish way of thinking, which took place in this crazy map of the Middle Ages, of which I've only been able to give you the smallest of tastes. And I hope some sense of the echoes of how these things still resonate today in our lives. Thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you.
Lots of questions. We have lots of questions, but before we have lots of questions, we have lots of brownies. So you can't ask good philosophical questions unless you've had sufficient number of brownies and chocolate chip cookies. So everybody get up, go out to the hall, take a brownie, take a cookie, take a coffee, use the restroom, pick up some flyers, talk to Alana about the trip to Israel, then come back in 5 minutes. We're going to study some more of the Jewish Middle Ages with Professor Holo. Well done. Good evening. Good evening, good evening. Please come and have a seat. We want to welcome back Professor Holo and thank you for your talk. And it's a marvelous opportunity to have a scholar that you can interrogate. Because there's all these questions you've always wanted to ask a scholar. And here he is, he's sitting here and he can't run away. So we can ask him like all the things we want to ask him. So let's begin with some very general questions and we'll get to some of the stuff the text that you presented. Come in. When I was a kid in Hebrew school, this period of time was called the Dark Ages. And we were taught that the Jewish Middle Ages is this, as you said, is the story of blood libel, persecution, and expulsion, right? That Jews were constantly running. I mean, from the year, from 622 until 1492, which are, 1492, we were expelled from Spain. It was just one miserable pogrom, destruction, blood libel, burning, after another. And then, when I was a college student, I read an essay by the great historian Salo Baron. Wonderful, wonderful Jewish historian, worked at Columbia University. And he wrote a story, and I had to look up the title because it has a word in it you wouldn't normally use. He called it the lachrymose theory of Jewish history. The word lachrymose has to do with tears. And he said, all of us were taught Jewish history as the constant story of Jewish persecution, oppression, and murder. He said, in fact, that's not the truth. In fact, yes, there were persecutions and other things, but for most part, Jews lived pretty well. I mean, they weren't exactly secure, but they lived well enough to have a creative and reasonably, not unreasonably different from other people of the Middle Ages, right? So, Doctor, which is it? Is the Middle Ages the terrible dark ages of Jewish persecution, or was the Middle Ages a period of Jewish creativity, Jewish life, punctuated by certain events of destruction?
I have an answer, sort of, but first on the word lacrimose, do we have any opera fans here? Anyone like that?
Yeah,
Do you
it's
know
a big opera.
you know the aria Una furtiva lagrima? Una furtiva lagrima. So lagrima is Italian for tear, and that's where the word lacrimose, lagrima, comes from. So you will never forget the meaning of lacrimose, and your assignment is, next time you're at a cocktail party, use the word lacrimose 3 times in the appropriate way, and you will have the title of Salo Baron's seminal and widely read and beautiful article in your mind. So, were the Middle Ages lacrimose? Was it tear-filled? I would ask a counter question before I answer, lest I appear to dodge. I know. It's the Jewish thing. So, was the 20th century lacrimose or not? Surely it was. It was the single greatest murder of our people in all of history, and perhaps all of human history. And yet, it was the founding of the Jewish state, the full flourishing of this American Jewish experiment, which we are all the beneficiaries of and contributors to, in one of the grandest expressions of Jewish civilization also ever. So, invariably, the honest answer is yes and yes, or no and no, or yes and no, and it's complicated. Here's what Salo Baron pointed out that is absolutely true. It was not a chain reaction of expulsion after expulsion with Jews carrying their backpacks to work every day for fear of having to run off. And it wasn't lacrimose in that way, in the way we imagine sort of the pogroms of the late 19th century, which also were not necessarily that. That's one thing he's trying to point out, that these historians talk in terms of centuries and events get stuck together, when in fact they happened lifetimes apart in the same century, or continents apart. That's one thing. The other thing he's pointing out is that Jews were more empowered than we think. Jews, not again, unlike American Jews, we have a lot of power in this country. We exercise our power without apology. We have channels for political and cultural expression. Jews would come into cities in Central and Western Europe, and they would make deals with the ruling powers, and they were good deals. They were deals that said, yes, we're a religious and communal minority, but we are going to negotiate for certain benefits, such as the right to bear arms, we've heard of that, or such as the right to conduct certain businesses in certain parts of town, and the right to require protection from the mob if that were a threat, etc. It was also, of course, a time of tremendous cultural production. The Maimonides, the Sa'adya Gaons, the Judah, the great poets, of Spain. Someone mentioned the golden age of Spain, and all of these guys. Yehuda Halevi is who I was thinking of. Forgive me, and I could go on and on. So it was very rich. There were these periods. I would say no more lacrimose than any other period of time that's long enough. One last brief answer to your question. Another question that's often asked is, was it worse in the Christian world or worse in the Muslim world for the Jews, or better in one or the other? And I come squarely on the side that it was better for Jews. On balance, I would rather have been a Jew in the Muslim world than to have been a Jew in the Christian world, for many reasons, which I'm happy to talk about, but I won't burden you now. So that's another concomitant question that gets raised together with the lacrimose one.
Were Jews better off in the Muslim world or the Christian world?
They were better off in the Muslim world because of what I tried to articulate today with respect to the conflict of Christianity and Judaism comes from the fact that they see themselves as owning the same story. And so when the Christians had to come to terms with the fact that the Jews had a different story in Talmud that messed with their own story and the Jewish story that they wanted the Jews to have for their own convenience so that they could have coherence in their own story, when that was disrupted or challenged, it created not just a communal problem of, wow, this minority of uppity Yidden is really a pain in the neck, but when the Jews get uppity, it reverberates through the centuries into their own story in a way that doesn't allow them to be indifferent. So if you get a Buddhist or let's say a Hindu in India, which is a majority Hindu country, and you get a small majority of Jews, nobody cares because there's no story that they share to fight over. But not so for Christianity. Islam is slightly closer to the Hindu model, not totally. I mean, it's a Semitic culture. It shares a lot in common with us. But fundamentally, no one ever claimed that Muhammad's revelation derived in any direct way from ours. And so there's really nothing to fight over. Now, when the Muslims get powerful, they exert political power, and they do oppress us in certain ways. But they don't have an ideological need to form us in their image, because we don't have the same story. And so that has political, economic, and social consequences that have, I think, probably the preponderance of historians agree with me, made it so that you were better off to be a Jew in the Muslim world.
My grandparents immigrated from Eastern Europe, and my grandmother in particular was very articulate about her attitude toward non-Jews.
I bet.
Right? Yeah. She was, and even though
I think
she
I know
had
your grandmother.
lots of non-Jewish friends, I mean, in general, she had nothing to do. She felt that we're civilized Jews and they are barbarians.
Yes. Right.
So, and she erected this psychological boundary. Now, that didn't stop her, by the way, from cooking a full menu of Eastern European dishes that any Eastern European person of the same generation would have cherished, right?
Recognize.
So I want to ask you about cultural interaction, both on the ground and in the higher intellectual levels. In Christian Europe and in Muslim lands, did we interact with the outside population? Did we share cultural forms with the outside population? Where was there more sharing, in the Muslim world and the Christian world? And how did we do that?
We did share many, many things, but it was heavily policed, the sharing. It was heavily policed physically by one form or another of a ghetto, even though they weren't technically what we call ghettos until the 16th century. There were Jewish neighborhoods, and they were relatively restricted Jewish neighborhoods. And your unlike in Enlightenment United States or Western Europe, your religious community was, you were born into it, and you were legally bound to it. So in Islam, you can become a Muslim. That's fine. They're happy to have you do that. But if you're Jewish, you cannot become a Christian. Or if you're Christian, you cannot become Jewish or anything else. These are heavily policed. So the churches, the mosques, the synagogues had legal statuses that affected how our money was spent, what charities we were allowed to give to, and that's a tremendous source of social control. Needless to say, also, there's an ethnicity thing going on here. There were Berbers, there were Arabs, there were Jews, there were Coptic Christians or whatever, and all of us lived with languages and cultures that were also policed. However, we shared a civic space. We had to lobby the same politicians for policies and for tax breaks and for access to ports, and for any number of activities in the common square, and language. Language is huge. We all know where Yiddish comes from and its Germanic qualities. We also, many of you may know that Arabic was very strong among Jews of the Arab world. And there were many business partnerships that allowed, and all kinds of cultural appreciation. The main barrier was class. Well, the main barrier was probably sex. If you were a woman, there was probably much less, except with your, maybe your handmaiden. But barring that, the main barrier, or the main conduit and barrier would be class, and how you can work across that or not, whom you hire to do your jobs, and what have you. In Christianity, there are problems raised by whether or not you can hire a non-Jewish servant in your house. And of course, we also know on the Jewish side whose wine you can drink and whom you can break bread with. All of these are very important. But at the higher levels, the philosophy stuff we're talking about, a real opportunity. They shared languages, they shared books, they shared scribal arts, and when the printing press came into being, the great Jewish printing presses were owned by non-Jews. And they hired Jews in Venice, yeah. So there's a lot of both, a lot of interaction and a lot of policing, and you get what you get.
I want to go back over that one idea, because it's an idea that most people don't understand. So we have a law of kashrut, which determines how Jews eat.
Yeah.
But what it did was it effectively separated Jews from eating meals with non-Jews, right?
Correct.
There's also a law about kosher wine. Now, all wine is made of grapes, and grapes are kosher, right? But there's a special set of laws of what wine you're allowed to drink and what wine you're not allowed to drink. It came to the point where the rabbis decreed that you couldn't drink wine unless it was Jewishly produced and Jewishly poured. To this day, by the way, if you go to a kosher restaurant and the waiter's not Jewish, he or she can't pour your wine for you, because that rule is still in force for very traditional Jews. Now, the reason was ostensibly, of course, wine is used in church worship. Before that, wine was used in pagan worship.
That's right.
And the idea is why they didn't want Jews touching sacred wine that's sacred to the outside community. But effectively what that did is if you can't have a drink with somebody, you're unlikely to end up married to them, right? And you limit social interaction, right?
That's right. That's right. Wine was so, in the pre-modern world, water is not really a beverage. Wine is a beverage, and you water it down, and that's how you drink. That's how you hydrate yourself. So it's huge. In fact, so powerful is wine, and so powerful is this prohibition, that in Jewish law, if you ask, is someone a kosher Jew or not, by saying, can I drink his wine? That's a legal category. If you can drink their wine, they're in, and if you can't drink their wine, they're out. And yes, and there's another whole set of questions about Jews determining whether or not Christian worship and the sacraments in particular are pagan libations. Hence that polytheist stuff going on, and why it's such a big question for the Jews. They can't just say, oh, they're pagan or they're not, because it affects whom they can buy from and what they can do.
Right. So I want to ask you a question about how you know this stuff, okay? You brought us texts from Maimonides and Sadia and the Disputation, which are widely sort of published, right? But there are sources, and I want you to describe the sources for us, that give us a sense of the daily life,
Yes.
commercial life, for example, of Jews of the Mediterranean. Tell us about those sources.
There are two great corpuses, bodies of literature that define most of our sources for Jewish history. One, which has been known in uninterrupted fashion since the Middle Ages themselves, is what we call responsa literature. And responsa is, as the name, it's a Latin plural noun, means responses, and they're legal responses to questions posed to rabbis, usually at a distance. That's why they're preserved, because they were written by letter, and then the response was in a letter. So Shmuley and Yankel, they have a dispute over a partnership in a piece of land, and the local rabbi in the shtetl really doesn't have the erudition to solve this highly complex legal problem, and he says, you know what, let's ask Rashi way out in France, because he's the man and he knows it all, and we'll agree beforehand that whatever he says, it's arbitration. We'll agree, his answer we will abide by. We agree beforehand, therefore no matter what he comes back with is binding. And then Rashi gets the letter, and the two litigants agree on the facts as expressed in the letter, and they say, okay, no, I agree that this description in this letter accurately describes both sides of the thing, and we send it to Rashi, and Rashi says, okay, if these are the facts, this is the legal principle at play, and based on this legal principle, I decide thus. Now, why is this an answer to Rabbi Feinstein's question? Because the questions that were posed in the mail to these great rabbis were A, practical daily questions. They were, in fact, about business partnerships. They were, in fact, about if I'm a partner with a Gentile and we have shared ownership of an ox, can the ox work on Shabbat if it's the Gentile owner who gets his portion on Shabbos or not?
So the Gentiles half of the ox can work.
Right, exactly.
Jewish half has the rest.
Those kinds of questions teach us about all kinds of things. They teach us about what was the agriculture, what were the beasts of burden, did they in fact have partnerships with Gentiles, et cetera, et cetera. Any number of things. Is this kosher? Is this not kosher? There are some harrowing questions that would make us very uncomfortable. There are questions of forced converts who want to come back to Judaism. And then they say, well, can I drink his wine? I don't know. And they have to add. So that entire literature, which is vast, is so useful even back then that they preserved it and they published it way back then because they wanted to know. Rashi has this great response about something that seems analogous. Let's rely on him because he was, after all, a gadol. He was a great man of his generation. Okay, so responsive literature is an entire field, and it's continuous. Since the Geonim, since Sa'adia Gaon, all the way before Sa'adia Gaon, really 200 years before him, all the way through. That's number one. And number two is the Cairo Geniza. The Cairo Geniza is a cache of letters and Sidurim and Sifrei Torah and Talmudim and all kinds of stuff that was preserved in the one of the synagogues in Fustat, Old Cairo. And it was preserved there because whenever something's written in Hebrew or is very sacred, we're supposed to bury it when it is in disuse or when it's worn out. But it's really a pain in the neck to keep digging a hole and bury it in consecrated ground for every little piece of paper. So what do? You put it in a room. You may have Geniza boxes around here, as we do at the Hebrew Union College, and you just store it until you have enough of it to make it worth your while to dig a hole, because it's a pain. It's a pain in the neck. So you just accumulate it. Well, this storeroom in the synagogue never got emptied out. And so it just accumulated, and the same climactic conditions that allowed the preservation of the mummies in Egypt also preserved these. There's even some paper, but it's mostly parchment. And these things were letters. You have guilt letters from Yiddish Mamala who are saying, why aren't you writing me, my son? And you have business partnerships. And you have students who are saving money to go to study in Israel, etc. You have this whole world, and it was compiled. It's still being published by scholars everywhere. It's a huge, vast, thousands of pieces of parchment and paper. The great historian Shlomo Dov Goitein wrote a 6-volume set of books called A Mediterranean World. So important is this cache of everyday life and letters and legal response, and it's vast in Hebrew, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Greek, etc. That it's one of the major sources for European or Mediterranean medieval history, far beyond Jewish history. So rich is it, and it's made the careers of many. And I myself began my career working with Geniza documents that my professor sent my way.
One more. Is this on? Yeah. So when you ask American Jews who their ancestors were,
Here, use this one.
Get this one here. When you ask American Jews who their ancestors were, everybody will tell you that their ancestors were very Orthodox rabbis. Because everybody knows that every Jew in Eastern Europe was a very Orthodox rabbi, and they all came to America in 1912 and settled on the Lower East Side and immediately started a synagogue and sat and studied Talmud all day long. Everybody, there were no tailors or horse thieves or card players. They're all rabbis, right? So we have this image that pre-modern Judaism before modernity, was Tevye, right? Everybody was from, right? Was everybody in the Middle Age from? Orthodox.
Okay, so we know that the great challenges to religious living that we know of go back to the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment and emancipation that led to things like Jewish socialists, and the other great story is the pink diaper baby story of the Jews who came to the Lower East Side, and they were they threw their tefillin over the boat when they came in and they saw the Lady Liberty. It's the flip side of that, but that's all postmodern. That's all in the modern period, and so it doesn't really answer your question. The question is, in fact, raised by Maimonides. Maimonides is thought, and this is disputed, but it is thought that heresy, and I use the word heresy, I called him a raging heretic because he inverted the priority of science and revelation, and he put science and rational thinking above Torah from Sinai. That prioritization is associated with something else. Now, whether or not this association is fair is a big, ugly Jewish historical question. But the 2 points that are being compared did exist. And the correlated point is the following. We know that in societies where there was enough liberal thinking going on, including in the Middle Ages, and enough wealth, where one could challenge traditional ideas with a certain amount of safety and comfort, that it is indeed true that there were populations of Jews, particularly in Spain, that were effectively maskilim. They were, quote-unquote, enlightened Jews. They were Jews who began to question the specificity of the demands of Jewish living and Jewish thinking and fundamentally Jewish theology. And this is really in the 13th century. This goes way back. And it evolved into the Spanish story, in which there was tremendous class and intellectual disputes, where we do believe there were in fact Jews who were either so universalistic as to just believe in sort of a mystical God that was that wasn't distinguished from the Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, or were in fact agnostic or even atheist philosophers. And that is why they burned Maimonides' books, because they associated his teaching, which puts rationalism above revelation, or at least you could argue it does. I do think it does, by the way. People disagree, but you can see why that fear, why it fed that fear to the point where you would burn his books, where Jews would tell on fellow Jews, to the Dominican authorities of all things, and say, burn that other Jew's books. That's pretty drastic, as I hope I conveyed to you. So yes, the answer was yes, but it was a small minority, a very, very specific. Most Jews were from, and from in the way that only insular communities can be for centuries on end.
Good. Questions? We have a few minutes for a few more questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. We have a microphone right over here. Okay, Dr.
While you're passing the question, I just want to clarify one thing. I got a great question over brownies. I fear I didn't make it clear enough that the second burning of the Talmud in 1244 was by the Catholic Church, as opposed to the one in 1232, which was promoted by Jews through the Catholic Church. Just a clarification.
I have a short comment. There's a huge difference between Jews living Islamic world, between Sunni and Shi'i. Everything you said is correct about living among Sunnis. And among Shi'is, it's a totally different story. There has been no problem, no difficulty with the Jews anywhere in the world, as has been, for instance, in Iran, specifically after 1501, which Safavid dynasty came to power. Just to give you a few words, in 13th century, there were 600,000 Jews in Iranian domain. And the number went down to 25,000 in 19th century. And that tells you a lot of story about how Jews been treated in that country, among Shiites.
Was there a difference between Sunnis and Shia?
Well, your point's well taken for the later period. In the Middle Ages, it was not a function of. It's not that there weren't differences. It's that the differences were irrelevant to the Jews. What was dominant was political, geographic, and social concerns. The great culture of Cairo, to which I referred, was in fact under a Fatimid Shiite kingdom, in addition to what was going on in Spain, which was Sunni. So there are variations, and the ups and downs didn't necessarily have to do with Sunni or Shia until much later. In this particular period of the Middle Ages, it was.
Iranian Shiis believe in 12 imams, and they're totally different than other Shiis in the entire world.
Yes, understood.
And these are completely different.
Agreed.
And if you study life of Jews in Iran after 1501, after Safavid came into Iran, it's a totally different story.
Agreed. We had.
Good. Other questions? Someone had a hand up. All the way over here. Carol. Wait, we got a microphone. We want to get you on tape for posterity, and you'll be immortal here.
You're talking in the Middle Ages about, a lot of it is the Sephardic world. What was happening in Russia
Good question.
and Germany and Poland, you know, because
Usually we associate the Eastern European Jewish experience that begins in its very, very beginnings in the 13th century, but it really doesn't get steam until the 15th century and 16th centuries, and really, really explodes demographically in the 17th century, and that takes us out of the Middle Ages. So it's actually the tail end, or really just past what we traditionally call the Middle Ages, where there was a massive migration from Central Europe, hence the Germanic quality of Yiddish, into the Slavic world, which is what we associate with the vast, vast populations of Jews in Poland and Russia.
So next week we will meet the most interesting intellectual character of the Jewish Middle Ages, Moses Maimonides, the gentleman whose books we burned on 1232. He'll be back right here at VBS in the person of Dina Aronoff, professor at Graduate Theological Union. So come back and we'll do the Middle Ages. Once again, thank you to Professor Holo for tonight's talk. It's still really wet outside, so be really careful driving home, okay? It's cold and wet, and Californians don't know how to drive in a rain, so be careful. Have a lovely night. Take care. Thank you. That was great. Wonderful, wonderful night. Wonderful talk. Great. Well done. You're right. Take some water. Plenty of water. Really nicely done. Nice, built around the